I want to welcome everybody to Sunday morning at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library, which is a project of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library. Our institute was formed about 15 years ago as the research and educational arm of the library to pursue the library's goals of keeping the written work heritage of Marx alive and supporting people's struggles in the Bay Area and elsewhere. What we are is a group of independent intellectuals, activists with an interest in Marx. Some of us are members of disciplined parties, some of us are members, I say, of undisciplined parties. Some of us are simply independent Marxists with an interest in this, but we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been for the past. And our speaker today is very appropriate for this because, as you all know, the nature of class struggle here in the United States has modified. It's kind of more interesting now. If you look at the Senate and the Congress and so on. And part of that is because Bernie took the primary route 4 years ago. I don't know whether he did it because he read Tom Gallagher's book on the primary route, or he came across this idea on his own. But at any rate, when I saw that Tom had written something on the primary route in 2020, I knew we needed to have him here at the library. So, and Tom is a former member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, a Bernie Sanders delegate to the 2016 Democratic Convention, and a current member of both the Progressive Democrats of America and the Democratic Socialists of America. So,
all right.
Thank you. There isn't the mic. I don't really need it, I just thought it was there. Good morning. I want to thank Jean for having me and for giving me all this time to describe the argument of the book. And when I say all this time, I will try to keep track of the audience and not abuse my time here. So as Jean said, it's actually 4 years ago I wrote this book that I sort of call a pamphlet because it's in the tradition of pamphleteering, that of writing something with a particular political cause in mind, arguing that if there was ever to be an electoral left in the United States, that it would require our having candidates in the presidential primaries, and for obvious reasons that would have to be the Democratic primary rather than the Republican primary. You just wouldn't get any votes in the Republican primary, and you might in the Democratic primary. And my joke was, when I put the book out, that my deal with the devil was that either the book would be a smashing success or the idea would be a smashing success, but not both. And you know how it turned out, and the more important one worked out. Actually I told Jean, this isn't the button, but Jean gave me my first Bernie Sanders 2020 button, actually, in this room, when it wasn't obvious that Bernie would go again. I expect that I'm probably dealing with a tough crowd on this question. In some ways a hard sell on what I'm arguing, and that's appropriate because I wrote the book for the tough crowds. In other words, if you've been a regular voter without some grand agenda, you don't need this argument. You just go vote in primaries because it's what you do. The people I wanted to make the argument for are the people who are looking for something significantly different in American politics than the mainstream of either party. And I defined the left very generally. You didn't have to call yourself a socialist, but any number of other things that we could define as a general left. And that's who I wrote it for. People who had problems, obvious with the Republican Party, but they had serious problems with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And I'm one of them. That's why I wrote it. You know, I go back, as I know some other people in this room do, to the anti-Vietnam War movement. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? 1968, vote with your feet, vote in the streets, because we got Hubert Humphrey and Nixon to vote for, two war supporters, right? So, you know, I started out in all of that. And although I've spent a great deal of time, been an office holder in the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. I've attended 2 presidential conventions, state conventions, etc. I've done a lot of things in the Democratic Party. I'll never forget the day that I decided, when I was first running for state representative, that I would run as a Democrat. I wanted to run as an independent. And I remember somebody at a party saying, you know, independents can vote in the Democratic primary. And of course, I was brand new to this. I didn't even know it at that point. So for reasons of having the greatest reach, that's where I wound up over the years. And my criticism of a lot of the Democratic Party's leadership has not changed. I do feel that if you look in Congress, there is a real difference. The Progressive Caucus is in the Democratic Party. The Black Caucus is in the Democratic Party. It's not an accident Bernie Sanders ran in the Democratic primary. On the other hand, there are many areas in which there's not a lot of difference, and the occasional area where the Democrats can be worse. For instance, when Donald Trump wants to talk to the president of Korea, I'm for that. I don't oppose it because he's for it and because the guy may be off the wall. The leaders of countries with nuclear weapons talking to each other and not just threatening each other, always a good thing as far as I'm concerned. There are areas where the leadership of the Democratic Party is essentially no different. If you look at Nancy Pelosi's statement on Venezuela, she mirrors Donald Trump almost word for word. I actually wrote a piece a while ago and I juxtaposed one paragraph after the other. It barely needed an editor. It was almost the same. And by the way, I am running against her next year, just in passing. So my critique has not stopped, but my assessment of what you have to do to be effective may be different than some people here. I was a net Ralph Nader supporter in 2000. I was at the time the president of the Bernal Heights Democratic Club and moved that the club endorsed Ralph Nader. The motion failed. But I thought at that point that it might be possible for the Green Party to build something in the interstices of the system. In other words, in states that weren't battleground states, where it was safe to vote for a third-party candidate. That turned out to just be wrong. It's too fine a point for most people. They were not able to distinguish that. And 19 years later, we're still arguing about whether he
Was a spoiler.
whether he was a spoiler. Yeah, whatever you think about it, you don't want that argument for 19 years. The Kucinich campaign in 2008, I guess, was the first one, if I've got my years right, maybe it was 2004, was sort of an answer to that. He ran in the Democratic primaries on a platform that was just as radical as Ralph Nader's was. So anyhow, that's sort of the background to it. And my argument is that while most people I know on the left would prefer to have a parliamentary system where you would have a party that you much more closely identify than the two big tent choices, you can't wish your way into that. And we have to, if you play the game, you need to know the rules. You need to know the rules not of the German parliamentary system, but of the American presidential system. And you have to figure out how to navigate that system, whether you want it to go away or not. If you can find a way to make it go away, great, another matter. The most interesting certainly graphic. One of the most interesting articles I ever saw in the course of the 2016 campaign, I think might have been in The Economist. Certainly was a British publication. And it was after all the presidential primaries were over. And they drew up a graphic of Congress or a parliamentary body of some sort and colored the seats according to the presidential primary vote in the US. So in other words, there was the largest block was the Hillary Clinton people, which translated to, you know, the mainstream establishment wing of the Democratic Party. The next largest block was the Bernie Sanders voters, which was the brand new phenomenon that didn't exist before that. Then you had on the right, you had the Trump voters, you had the group they called the Kasich voters, sort of like the, you know, the civilized Republicans, and they had yet another, and I can't remember quite who they were. And so if that had translated into a political body, if you had actually voted on that way, the outcome would have been a coalition government between the Clinton voters and the Sanders voters, and Clinton would have been the prime minister because they had more, right? Now, if we were in a parliamentary system, we would understand that. It's how the game is played. You have two groups that fought like cats and dogs in an election, but when they get there, if they don't have a majority, you assess who are you with. Well, if you're the Sanders people, you're obviously not with the Trump people, you would align with the Clinton people. The differences wouldn't go away. You would negotiate an agreed upon program. People probably have some knowledge, I imagine, of the German party system. It's kind of one of the purest parliamentary systems that I'm aware of. When the Greens were dissatisfied with the Social Democrats, both on environmental issues and on war economy sort of issues, they broke. They formed a new party. There's a 5% hurdle you have, so if you only get 3%, you know, you've lost it. But once you get to that hurdle, you can now form a government with the party you left, which is what happened in Germany. And you now are able to negotiate on the basis of your votes, and certain things are going to be incorporated into the government joint policy. That is what I call, when you write about political science, you got to have fancy words, I find. I mean, I'm not a professional at this, but sociology, political science, you got to come up with a word. So my word for that is an additive system. A parliamentary system is an additive system. So if I used to be a social democratic voter and I want to go off to the Greens, and of course now we have the left party, which is a whole other complex thing, added to the mix, I can vote for that party knowing that my vote will be added to that of the big party that I'm closer to than the other big party, than the Christian Democrats. So I don't lose it. In presidential election politics in this country, we have what I have dubbed a subtractive system. So if you go back to the Nader election, and Gore would have been closer to most people than Bush, but when they opted to vote for Nader, there was no way to get that vote added back at the end under our system. And in a sense, absent Nader, it's subtracted from the Gore vote. So, as I said, I did support Nader. I was not thrilled with the choice that year, and the point isn't to pump up those candidates from that period. But it is a fundamentally different phenomenon. And the reason that I argued for the primary route, as I called it, was that is the place where you can have your differences and you wind up with one candidate at the end who maybe you don't love, but you don't wind up inadvertently electing the worst possibility. Donald Trump, right? You know, beyond for what we thought was possible a few years ago. So that's the argument to it. If you look at history, which I think is worthwhile in this, the heyday of left-wing third parties was over 100 years ago. It was 1912. Eugene Debs got 6% of the vote. And the 1912 election was very interesting in a couple of ways. Number one, a sitting president, William Howard Taft, finished third because Teddy Roosevelt, the former Republican president, decided he would run an independent candidacy, the Bull Moose candidacy. We all learned it in school and so forth. And basically got Woodrow Wilson elected. The Democrats hadn't won an election in 20 years until Teddy Roosevelt won it for them, and Taft finished third. The other unusual thing about it was, with Debs getting 6% of the vote, it was the first time that you had 4 candidates with 5 or more % of the vote. So for a lot of people, it looked like this might be a sea change, right? You know, this is now 107 years ago, right? At that point, the Republican Party was less than 60 years old. It had come into existence in the presidential arena in 1856, and it never finished out of the top 2. But, you know, there were, in living memory of some people, there had been a Whig Party, which had been the number 2 party, and maybe it was going to change. Maybe the socialists were going to rise to fill in that gap. As we know, none of this happened. The Republicans have never finished out of the top 2. The Democrats haven't finished out of the top 2 in longer than that. As I say, it was the high point of left-wing, independent left-wing presidential candidacies, with one exception. The only, since Debs's run in 1920, his last one from the jail cell, when he got 3.4% of the vote, I think. Since that time, there's been only one candidate, independent left-wing candidate, to get as much as 3% of the vote. But of course, he happened to be a Republican. For you students of American history, Robert La Follette, a left-wing Republican senator. Imagine such a thing, but they actually exist. In 1924, he got 17% of the vote. But in terms of somebody not connected with the parties, no one's gotten 3% in 99 years. This could change. Anything could change, but I ain't betting on it. In 200 years, will we have these 2 parties? Probably not. 50 years? This has been pretty consistent. So I do think we have to deal with this fact. You know, a couple of back in 15, I'm sure I've waved this at you before. Progressive Democrats of America, a group that I joined, it came out of the Kucinich campaign, a group that I joined because actually of its attention to foreign policy. Its attempt to deal with national issues on the local level, which is, if you dabble in electoral politics, is pretty hard to do. People regard that as a very far away thing. PDA had this campaign, Run Bernie, Run as a Democrat. And as Gene suggested, or, you know, I don't think Bernie's even read my book, much less decided to make a decision. Sad but true. And I don't claim that PDA's campaign was the decisive thing either, but they had it right. And if you remember back in 2015, a lot of people thought there's no way Bernie Sanders runs as a Democrat. He's the most famously independent member of the U.S. Congress in history. He's the longest serving independent in that body. He would never run as a Democrat. But despite his personal history, he came to the same conclusion. Hey, you know, I could go my own way, and if I get 3% of the vote in the final, I've made history and will probably be damned for the rest of my life. He opted for this. And as Gene has been alluding to, it's a new world, as far as I'm concerned. The fact that the people proclaim themselves democratic socialists openly. DSAs exist, it's tenfold growth in membership, simply as a result, I think, of having the right name. Because people heard Bernie Sanders say he was a democratic socialist. They said, well, yeah, I've heard the phrase, and I believe all of that stuff. You can say it out loud now, and they Google democratic socialist, and what do you get? Democratic Socialists of America. And I really think if they had a different name, it might, it would have grown, but not like the way it did. Serendipity in life. I guess, one other point I want to make on the idea of working within the Democratic Party, even if you don't like everybody you meet at the meetings. Again, I suspect there are some serious students of American labor and left-wing history here. You know about the idea of dual unionism. The idea, the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, were an example. In really ancient times, the Socialist Labor Party had their own unions, the Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance. The Communist Party, in its early, very radical days, had their own separate unions because they felt the leadership of the AFL was corrupt in some ways, or they believed in the capitalist system. They didn't believe in changing it. Well, eventually, the decision was you can't do it. Right? It's just not going to work. You're going to have to be in the unions where most of the people are. And what I argue in terms of working within the Democratic Party on the presidential election is analogous to that. It doesn't mean you change your views. And I should also say that I don't argue that third parties are useless. I think there are arenas where they are useful. If you are in local elections, are often nonpartisan. We've had independent mayor of Richmond, former Green. I think she was no longer Green when she got elected. It can work, and I don't condemn them in any way. I just, on the presidential level, I think it is a strategic mistake. And I think the one more thing I want to say before seeing what's on your mind is to, I've heard Gene actually talk about this in another forum, the comparison of then and now. As I mentioned, 1912 was the high point of Socialist Party presidential politics. In 1920, when Debs ran from the jail cell because he had spoken out against the World War, he got more votes. He got over 1 million, but that was because it was the first election that women could vote in, amazingly enough. It's coming up just on 100 years. That's all. Isn't that amazing? And so the electorate was much larger. His high point was 6% roughly in 1912. The actual vote was 1,551. Actually, some people say he probably had a lot of votes stolen from him in lots of places they just threw away, but I can't speak to that. But a little over 900,000 in a population of 95 million at that point. If you were to expand that vote,
population or electoral participants?
No, the overall population was about 95 million in 1912. If you were to inflate that 900,000 number based on the growth in population, which I didn't write down in 2016, something like 330, 340 million, that would come out to 3,052,251, a little over 3 million. So that's the level that Debs's maximum vote. Bernie Sanders' vote in 2016 was 13,206,428. That's 4 times the amount. What I referred to, Gene had once pointed out, and I have used it. As far as we can tell, the vote that Sanders got in 2016 was more than the combined total of every single socialist presidential candidate in history.
Sorry, you mean in the primaries?
Yeah. Yeah, just and right, it's only the primaries, right? He wasn't in a final. So, I mean,
A lot
I
of
don't.
people wrote him in the general election.
Yeah, but a sec. So as has already been alluded to, this is something. This has changed the world in significant ways. As I say, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez phenomenon. Whoa. I mean, it's only one person. I don't want to go crazy. We only have this handful with a fair number of progressive, quite good people in Congress. Only a couple that will call themselves socialist. But nonetheless, in terms of the general discussion of this country, I suggest to you that this candidacy was a sea change. I don't know where it goes in the long run. Obviously, Bernie's going again, and obviously, I actually think we can do it. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I would not have been expecting to stand here in front of you and say that I thought a socialist could actually occupy the White House. There's, as I say, in Congress we have only a small number, et cetera, and we're not quite on the verge of the socialist democracy that we might like. But again, I'll just close with saying I think it is a brand new world. And it's because Bernie took my wise advice to take the primary route. So, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And we're going to have some Q&A and give you a chance to respond and